Okay, so just to briefly go over the intro for Code of the Street. So before we get into it, I kind of need to stress the importance of research methods. So sociology is a social science, right? Because of that, people that make sociological claims have to use validated research methods to make their claims, right? They can't just, oh, this is something I see, so therefore it exists, right? You have to use that scientific method in order to kind of devise your results. So you can't just make an argument, it has to be proven using some version of that method. And the sociological imagination is another important concept, especially for this course. It's really the ability to see the bigger picture by connecting an individual person's biography with the larger social forces that shape an individual's chances and opportunities in life. So, for example, example I'll be giving you is one of my mentors. He wrote a book called The Stick Up Kids, and he was really looking at the experiences of these Dominican drug robbers and how, he basically argued that as much as they were committing these really violent crimes, um, they were really just in search of the American dream, right? They just didn't have the kind of structured opportunities that would give them, other pathways. So basically saying that, like, yes, when you look at someone's individual choices, did they choose to rob people? Did they choose to, burn people with irons in order to get their drugs? Yes, right? But they did so within limited means of opportunity, right? It's not as if there were just full-time jobs all around the all over the place. And this is something, I'm going to add in your supplemental materials online, a PBS documentary kind of speaking to that effect, that you can watch if you would like to, that really kind of hammers in how the structured lack of opportunities in these inner city areas is what leads to a lot of the poverty. And the poverty itself and the desperation that it causes leads to a lot of the crime. So we can't just necessarily put more cops on the street or put more rules in place. We need to actually address the structural issues that make it so that people that are poor just can't find a good job, right? Can't get a good education, etc. Those are the things that are really going to lift people out. So it's important to look at that with the sociological imagination, meaning looking at people's individual experiences, but keeping them in the context of the history, the culture, and the opportunities and structures that they have. So this book itself is an ethnography, which means, an ethnography is a social research method where a researcher spends a long period of time studying a certain group of people or a social location in order to find out the meanings and understandings of the people who live in these areas or in those conditions. So it's very hard to replicate, obviously. It can be biased in various ways, hence the length of the ethnography, right? But it still tells us a lot about social life. But it is situated within the time period where it took place. So, for example, my future, not ex husband, just future husband, we're going to work it out. This professor at, well, maybe I shouldn't say, because then you'll look him up and you'll be like, oh, damn, I see why she says that. Anyway, University of Chicago. You'll figure it out. It's fine. But anyway, this guy, future husband, he did this really interesting research study that just became a book recently, looking at Skid Row and the understandings that people had of Skid Row. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in class. But just to speak to the idea that he spent over 2 years on the streets in Skid Row. So if you wanted to replicate that study and say, okay, did he find something valid? If I did the study myself, would I find the same thing? You're going to be hard pressed to find most, social researchers that are willing to sit in Skid Row for 2 years. So, you know what I mean? Those kind of things make it a little bit more difficult to reproduce ethnographies, but they give us a window into the social life of people. Okay, so he talks about the physical, like, topography of the neighborhood. He talks about how violence is a feature of urban life. Violence happens often, and it regulates the behavior of all people in the neighborhood, even if they're law abiding or not. So he argues that on Germantown Avenue, there's a code of civility at one end and a code of the street at the other. So he uses Germantown Avenue as a microcosm of the differences in urban environment based on the wealth or social class of the people that live in it. So it's a range from the affluent, well-to-do, well-manicured area of Chestnut Hill to the far end of the avenue that is strewn with drugs, dilapidated structures, empty, burned out lots on the other end, right? So starting at the rich end, Chestnut Hill, He starts here and explains the ways that people interact with each other in this space, the racial dynamics, the fact that people feel safe and non-threatened by violence in those areas. He also talks about how sometimes the crime from farther down the avenue spills into the rich areas, but it's very rare. But this brings about awareness that the violence exists somewhere nearby. So most of the criminals who are caught committing these crimes in Chestnut Hill are young African American men. So what does this do? It creates a social assumption that crime is committed by young black men in the minds of the wealthier residents of Chestnut Hill. So, further down Germantown Avenue, you get to Mount Airy. This is a more racially integrated neighborhood than Chestnut Hill, right? Chestnut Hill's overwhelmingly white people. More black people are present on Germantown Avenue and Mount Airy. These are mostly middle class people, while middle class white residents are more likely to use the shops in Chestnut Hill. So even though they live in Mount Airy, they go hang out in the rich white folk area. So that makes Mount Airy appear predominantly black, even though the neighborhood demographics are pretty split. So he starts to talk about the features of the neighborhood, what starts to look different. So the first thing that starts to look different in Mount Airy from Chestnut Hill are bars and gates appear on storefronts. So there's a physical change in the shops. Like there's certain things that they offer, like you're not going to see a lot of pizza places in like wealthy areas or liquor stores. In this area, Mount Airy, you see a lot of black-owned barber shops. Everything's very middle class. But of course, the appearance of needing gates makes crime somewhat slightly more visible than in the wealthy area. And of course, in this area, black middle class youth hang out on the street. These youth often adopt the clothing and postures and style of their neighbors that are farther down the block, which makes these youth indistinguishable from poorer youth for some residents, right? So that causes problems with store owners and the police in the neighborhood because they don't know the difference between a kid that's wearing, tennis shoes and a shirt that's middle class, hanging out trying to be cool, and an actual drug criminal, right? So also, they talked about this idea of knowing what time it is, right? So this just means being aware of people, being aware of places and situations that are putting you at risk for violence, so that you kind of have to have your eyes open. He also talks about how, the farther he goes down the avenue, the more liquor stores and empty lots become normative. And the stores change to laundromats, Chinese food takeout, strip malls that are worn and weary, and the more and more boarded up buildings and empty lots. So he argues that certain disregard for the law becomes more visible the farther you go down the avenue. So people are publicly drinking in the park or while walking down the street. So he said that, you start to see the threat of violence causing different ways of acting for residents. So when you get to Broad Street, you've hit, what he calls hyper ghetto, which is a concentration of ghetto poverty. So this means a couple things. First, that this group of people are socially isolated from mainstream America. So the reality of people's lived experiences are shielded from the larger social narrative, right? The larger social narrative that if you work hard, you will succeed in society, right? That's not true for them. They are kept from the material resources of society, whether they work hard or not. So that means that you kind of already don't believe in the narrative of the society because it doesn't include you. Also, there's this constant threat of violence and people kind of verbalizing that they have someone's back, right? That the threat is very real. And so the idea of needing support and needing people to have your back is very important. So you have, people saying, watch your back, or I got your back, or things of that to kind of indicate that violence is an ever-present threat. And of course, before I get to composition, the morning time is the safest, right? That's when people go out and do things. In the neighborhood, once nightfall happens, that brings the code of the street. So the toughest, the biggest, the boldest are the ones that are out on the street at night. So when it comes to the composition of the neighborhood, it's mostly poor women and children. He reported seeing a lot of young, pregnant mothers in the neighborhood, as well as extended family like aunts, grandmothers, sisters, cousins. When it comes to the roles of men in the neighborhood, most are not fathers. Most are cousins, nephews. Actually, the majority are youth. And when it comes to the makeup of kinship networks in the community, something we'll talk about much more in detail when he gets into the book, this is just him bringing it up in the intro, is that female mothers and extended family make up the kinship networks of the community, trying to help out when someone needs that help. So that kind of leads to what we, this topic that we talk about within sociology called the feminization of poverty. So the feminization of poverty is just the fact that more women live in poverty than men due to various social factors like pay inequity, where men earn more than women at every level of education, cost of childcare, and other social factors that we'll kind of get into throughout the book. So once it keeps going farther down the avenue, he does a great job of explaining what it looks like and what it feels like. So he talks about the drug culture and the inner city experience. So the fact that drug culture and street culture are very intertwined and oftentimes hard to sort out the difference. So first he mentions how young men are profiling on the street. So something we'll talk about a lot more, and he goes into the details of this in a couple chapters from now. But he talks about seeing young men dress nicely in clothes that they couldn't afford by legitimate means, to profile themselves as dealers or just as someone clocking, right, quote unquote. Someone that's working in the drug game, right? To have the nicest shoes, the nicest clothes when you're in a situation of dire poverty, that's going to be a marker of your status, right? And he also talks about corner men, which are what he calls the young men that are sometimes grade school aged that hang out on the corner that cover or look out for drug dealers. So often these kids are somewhat dealers themselves. So they'll use code words to sell out in the open, or often they're just going to, if they see a cop turning onto the block, notify someone farther down the block to, put away their drugs before the cops roll down the street. And like I said before, it's difficult to separate the drug culture from the experiences of poverty that these kids have. So the corner men and other drag activities are very visual. Parents of the children engaged in these activities are often aware that they're happening. So it's not as if parents are like, yay, my kid is out on the street selling drugs, but they do have some tacit approval because the kids are bringing in much needed money, right? People are living in dire poverty. They're already working multiple jobs just to try and get by. So if your kid's out there on the street, even though he's risking arrest, risking experiencing violence, they simply need the money. So they let their kids do these activities, right? When it comes to neighborhood culture, the strong survive. Those that are strong and, like something that someone else has, they take it. Knowing how to show the proper amount of respect and avoid confrontations is necessary to survive in these situations. So the consequence is that many see all the youth as uncivilized because they take these kind of atypical experiences that are happening from certain youth and apply to all youth within the community. When it comes to physicality of the neighborhood, the farther he walks down the avenue, the poorer the area becomes. So the physical surroundings change considerably, right? So he keeps going down the avenue and, there's houses that are falling apart, littered with, rent by the hour hotels. There's gunshots visible in buildings. And of course, this area used to be a bustling commercial area with lots of factory jobs. So when it comes to kind of applying that sociological imagination, the reality is, as jobs left an already marginalized area, few resources towards a decent paying job disappeared, and this left people in a desperate state where they're willing to break the law in order to keep a roof over their heads. So then he talks about how, briefly, that the small shops are mostly the same when he keeps going down the street, that the black ghetto gives way to a Hispanic ghetto. So meaning that the shops are the same, they just cater to different cultural foods and needs, but it's still rampant with the idea of the code and the physical devastation of the neighborhood. There just tends to be some racial segregation going on there. So the code of the street. This is the most important problem facing inner city residents, is the threat of violence, right? The threat of aggression and interpersonal violence. So this affects people's daily lives and spills into areas farther up the avenue. So the threat of violence keeps some people out of public areas, or at least inside at night, in order to avoid problems. So the inclination to violence is a result of life circumstances, right? The fact that there's not good paying jobs. These are those larger societal institution issues. This is linked to the switch from manufacturing to the service economy that devastated some inner city communities like Detroit, where they relied on factory jobs for high paying jobs. And so there's also very limited public services. It takes a while for the cops to show up. So the response times are very slow. Many people are alienated from public assistance that should be there to help them because of the stigma of race, right? There's also the fallout of the drug trade and drug use, meaning that, this also is included into the neighborhood violence and has an effect on all those families that have addicts within their family. So most people know someone who is strung out, and this affects a lot of families and children. And again, this will kind of come down to the idea of decent and street, where the barrier is. We'll talk about that later. Also, there's this issue of alienation and no hope for the future. This comes from living in an alienating environment without a way to legitimately get out. You feel like you give up on society because society's given up on you. So living in this environment puts everyone at risk, especially young people at risk. So the most effective counter to this that he argues is a decent family, which pushes more middle-class values and ethics that are contrary to the code of the street. So we'll talk about that throughout the book. So the norms of the street are consciously opposed to those of mainstream society. So they're in contrast to the values of larger society because they represent a group that's marginalized. They aren't granted access to the opportunities of larger mainstream society. There's no level playing field in action. So why should they buy into a society that doesn't support them, right? So, there's two organizations that organize the community, what they call the decent and street. So their interactions determine the boundaries of the code. When it comes to the code of the street, this is the informal rules for governing interpersonal public behavior, particularly violence. So kind of like a set of rules of how you're supposed to act in situations of conflict. So this regulates the use of violence by giving rules for handling conflicts, which are enforced by people who are street. So, an example I like to give is first time I took a crim class, I remember I had this professor, he's like a 25-year veteran, and he of LAPD as a psychologist, and he told the story about this guy who didn't understand gestures. And maybe I'll explain this to you in class, where some guy lifted up his hands and gestured at him like, what? And this other dude crossed the street, pulled a sign out of the ground, those like no parking anytime or signs like that, pulled it out of the ground and beat the guy to death with it. And it was just because he raised both his hands in a question like, what? But it was because, again, when you're challenged under the code of the street, if you don't retaliate with violence, you are then seen as losing. You are then seen as losing ground and power. So we'll talk about this much more as it goes on. But this is really the first kind of time he's introducing what does it mean, right? There are penalties. If you violate the rules, this could be fatal, right? In some cases, if you don't follow the rules. So you need to know how to live in public. Even the parents of decent families have to teach their kids some part of the code so they can survive, so that they can avoid confrontations in their neighborhood and in public spaces. So the heart of the code is respect, getting props, as it's called in the book, right? So in the inner city, impoverished environment, people feel bullied by forces outside of their control. So they want some respect, at least in their own community. But this is problematic as it's uncertain how to determine how much respect a person deserves. So it's hard won and easily lost, meaning you have to guard that respect. So the rules provide a framework for negotiating respect, who deserves it, who should give it, and how it should be done. So avoiding altercations often means survival, literally. Since some of these confrontations are deadly, learning the code and knowing how to keep yourself safe is essential. So dissing, which is something that's seen by the middle class as pretty petty. So making too much eye contact, right? That could be considered dissing. But to people who are invested in the code, they see it as an affront to their status and to their props. So it's seen as a challenge or an insult, however innocuous it is, right? Just looking at a person by accident, right? Stepping on someone's shoes. So the reality of the world of the street is a profound sense of alienation from mainstream society and institutions. So the code itself has become a cultural adaptation. Due to lack of faith in the police and the criminal justice system, people made their own way to kind of deal with these issues. So I'll leave it there for today. When we come back to class on Wednesday, we'll discuss, um, some discussion questions on this topic.